So my name is Audra Sabo, and I'm a Plant Health Supervisor for the Ohio Department of Agriculture on the Asian Longhorn Beetle program. So we shorten Asian Longhorn Beetle to ALB, and we work on a project to look for this beetle and the signs that the beetle has been in the trees in this part of Ohio. So we're in Bethel, Ohio, and this is the only part of Ohio that Asian Longhorn Beetle is found. It's been in other parts of the country before, like New York and Massachusetts and Chicago, and we think it came into the United States on wooden shipping material. So some sort of wood packaging, and there were enough beetles to reproduce and start a new population. So it's native to Asia, came over to the United States, and it really likes maple trees. So that's its favorite food tree to infest, and we have a lot of maple trees around here. So that's why we're here looking for the signs of the damage. We don't want to get this beetle to be widespread like emerald ash borer, if you're familiar with that one. And that beetle only goes after one species of tree, the ash tree. And we've seen how much damage that can cause throughout this part of the country. And this beetle can go after 12 different species of trees. So it's really could impact us a lot. In Ohio, it was first noticed in 2011. So we've been here for a long time, actually. And it was a homeowner. He was out looking at his trees, noticed that a maple didn't look healthy and that there were holes and tunneling in it. So holes in the inner part of the tree, not a lot of insects do that. So that was concerning to him. And he called the DNR, Division of Forestry, and they were able to collect a larva and send it off for DNA testing, and it came back as Asian Longhorn Beetle. So it went from one homeowner saying, hey, my tree looks kind of sick, to a federal quarantine within a couple weeks. Wow. So we placed this quarantine line, which is basically an imaginary line, around where we found the beetle. And there's more rules and regulations inside this quarantine zone than there are outside. And most of them pertain to wood products. So if you're working with a wood material and you cut down a tree inside the quarantine zone, you can't take it from inside out. And that includes firewood even. So that's pretty important around here. We have a park, a state park that has a campground, and we're also not far from the Ohio River where a lot of people like to camp, and a lot of people take firewood with them. So the movement of firewood can help transfer this beetle farther than it would naturally spread by itself, and that's what we really try to regulate. But we also look at every host tree within that quarantined area for signs of the beetle. So that's what most of our people do. We call it surveying, and we look at the trees literally with binoculars, and we look for signs that the beetle has been there. For us, it's any hardwood species 4 foot in length or smaller. We consider that firewood. And we do that because once you cut a piece of wood that small, sometimes the bark will fall off, and it just gets harder and harder to identify that species. So within the quarantine, if you cut down firewood, you can move it within the quarantine, but you can't move it out. Great question, because like with any invasive species, they have to be here long enough and they have to establish themselves, and the population has to build up enough for someone to notice. Mm-hmm. So that probably is what happened in this case. It's hard to tell how long. We estimate probably 10 years before we actually found it. And one of the ways we can do that is through dendrochronology. So dendro is trees and chronology is time, right? So we are lucky that our trees around here lay down annual rings. So So if you've ever counted tree rings before, there's a dark and light line, and each one of those equals 1 year. So tree biology, basically the outside edge of the tree is where the tree is alive. The inside is essentially dead wood. There's no nutrients or chemicals being moved through this central area. And ALB tunnels into the heartwood. So once it's tunneled into the heartwood, that tree can't heal itself, and that piece of damage, like a tunnel, will always remain there. So we can cut down the tree and count back how many rings it was when it got infested. So the outside edge will try to heal itself, but the inside can't heal itself. So we can use that as a tool to help us figure out how long they've been in certain areas of the quarantine. Yes, so the first infestation was found in 1996.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was in New York. And some of these other places make more sense to me because there's more international trade, there's ports of harbor there. So since the 90s, there have been a lot more rules and regulations put on shipping material. Either have to heat treat it or chemically treat it, but that is timely and costly, so there's always going to be somebody that's trying to get around the rules, and that's how things get shipped in wood packaging material and coming into the United States. And it's interesting that in all these different parts of the US, these were individual infestations. It didn't start in New York and spread to New Jersey and Mass. Those were all individual populations that came over from Asia. And we tested those with DNA testing, so we know that for sure. And up until this point, Ohio was the southernmost infestation in the US, but last year they found an infestation near Charleston, South Carolina. And that actually has the same DNA as the one in Ohio. So we're still trying to figure out how it got there. That's a great question that I don't have too much scientific knowledge on. I know that you're not supposed to burn chemically treated wood because of the chemicals that are changing them, when they are actually burnt. So I'm sure it does change how it breaks down. And you're right, there are environmental consequences for, every action we do. So right now, when we find an infested tree, what we're doing in Ohio is cutting that tree down. And we make it into mulch. So very small, 1 inch by 1 inch mulch. And it goes through chippers several times. And so if all that mechanical action of chipping didn't kill every life cycle stage of the beetle, then that very small piece of mulch isn't enough wood and nutrients for it to complete its life cycle. So right now, when we find a tree infested, we cut it down. That's no cost to the homeowner. This is a federal emergency program. So we cut it down and mulch it, and anybody that lives within the quarantine area can come get that mulch free. But then we also take that excess, and the company that actually runs the chippers uses it as their mulch, and we consider it deregulated at that point. So it's small enough that we are not worried about that piece of wood being infested by ALB. So right now the consequence is cutting down trees. We are cutting down lots of trees, but what I always keep in mind is the greater good, right? So if we didn't cut down the small amount of trees in this small part of Ohio, this could spread to the rest of Ohio, to the rest of the eastern coast. So, certain trees grow in certain habitats. And for the most part, the northeastern coast has the same type of tree makeup. We have lots of oaks and hickories and maple trees. So the Asian longhorn beetle loves maple trees. So if we were to let this get out of hand, really the entire northeastern coast could be drastically changed.
So
That's a good question. And the first one I think of, because I'm a sweet tooth, is maple syrup. So we wouldn't have any maple syrup if we didn't have any maple trees. But Other ones, it can be used as lumber, as cabinetry, pretty, finishes for furniture in your house. It's not as used as like oaks and hickories, but it can be. It also is a big tourism tree. It's not a direct one that I think of most of the time, but fall colors, when trees turn fall colors, especially along the East Coast, people will travel to see that, and maple is a very pretty fall leaf, so that's a big one as well. So maple is a main component of our woods around here. So it's one of the most common species of trees that you'll find, and it's typically an understory tree. So if we were to lose all of our maples, something else would take its place, just like what is happening with our ash trees. So emerald ash borer has come through and almost killed all of our ash trees around here, and other trees will take its place. What we hope to happen is that natural, native plants will take its place, like spice bush that is native to the area. But what happens in some areas is that invasives and other invasive vegetation will come in earlier and quicker and just take over. So that is a potential that could happen. If we removed all these maples, something else would take their place, and it could be invasive non-natives like honeysuckle. It's a 1-year life cycle. It can be 2, but most of the time it's 1. So we have an adult that's actually a fairly large beetle. It's almost an inch to an inch and a half, and it's very showy. It's got a shiny black body with these random white spots and very long antenna. So that's where that name longhorn comes from, the long antenna. And they can fly, but they don't fly well. So they typically crawl along branches of trees. But we look for signs of the beetle that's been there more so than the adult itself. So that adult female has really strong mandibles, chewing mouth parts, and she'll chew an egg site into the tree, a little oviposition pit, and she'll lay 1 egg per egg site. And the eggs are about the size of a grain of rice. And those pits are just along the outside edge of the bark, very shallow pits. So if that egg turns into a larva, it'll start tunneling into the tree around the outside, but then it'll tunnel into the heartwood. So heartwood, again, is that dead wood, and it'll tunnel very into the center of the tree, overwinter there. So it'll continue to eat, continue to grow, go into a pupa stage, and then turn into an adult. And when it comes out as an adult, it's coming straight out of that heartwood, and it leaves this perfectly round exit hole. So most of the life stages are actually within the tree, and that larva is what is damaging the tree. So it's tunneling around, creating these holes that the tree can't heal, and structurally that tree is weakened, and eventually it will die. So egg, larva, pupa, and adult, and most of the time it's just 1 year. The adults emerge out of the trees in May, and they can keep emerging out all summer, and the female can lay up to 100 eggs in her lifetime, so one female can chew up to 100 of these egg sites. August is what we call tree check month, and that's because at this point all of those adults have already emerged out of the trees, and this is the best time that we're going to be able to see the adults around. Your trees also have leaves on them right now in the summer. They're fully leafed out, so it's a little bit harder to see the branches, but we work year round, and when the leaves fall off in the winter, we can see all sides of the trees. And we also have tree climbers that can climb up and get right to the spot that we're worried about. Maple trees can get pretty large, up to 100 feet, I would say. They don't typically get that large around here because we usually cut them down, right? So whether it's farming or logging or building a new house, typically maples don't get to their full potential. So I would say around 60 feet is normal. And we look from the ground just with binoculars, and we work in crews, and we surround the tree, so we're looking at it from different angles. And we, if we can't figure out what something is for sure, then we have tree climbers that come back and will climb all the way up to that spot and take a closer look.
So somebody's job is to climb trees here.
Yes.
They got it made.
And it's a little bit different type of climbing too, because they're not cutting down anything. They're looking, surveying for ALB. So that's a kind of a unique tree climbing job, is that they use a bunch of ropes, they don't use gaffs, they don't want to injure the tree more than it already might be. So yeah, it's a very interesting, unique job. That's a good question as well. So if we think about the globe and kind of laterally where we are, it makes sense that we have very similar trees than parts of Asia do. And they have maples there as well. And because those trees evolved with the beetle there, those trees have native defenses against the native beetles. So what happened here is our native trees don't have defenses against a non-native beetle, and that's why they die. But in Asia, what is interesting is that they grow poplar in plantation type of settings. So like a crop of poplar trees. They grow very straight and tall and quick, and Asian longhorn beetle can infest those, but they'll plant maple trees kind of as trap trees.
The sacrifice tree.
Yes, so they're all attracted to the maple tree, and they'll infest that instead of the other trees. So the natural spread of ALB is very slow. So it's a big beetle, and it's very taxing on its energy to fly to another tree. So one beetle could emerge from a tree and reinfest that same tree. She could chew egg sites all over that tree or the surrounding trees before she's going to use that energy to fly to another group of trees. So as a management standpoint, that actually helps us, that it's a slow natural spread. The human-assisted spread is what is really fast and really far. So that's why we have more rules about firewood and that type of thing. Yeah, that's always a good question with a non-native species, right? Like, what is going to eat it here, and how is it going to fit into our ecosystem? So I don't know that much about the animals over in Asia, but I would assume like other insects and other flying insects that use trees as their home and their food, woodpeckers and lots of birds, right? So woodpeckers will go after bugs that are inside of the tree, and they'll create their own holes in trees. And we actually look at a lot of woodpecker holes thinking that they might be Asian longhorn beetle. So that some of the differences are going to be that our egg sites have these mandible scars on the outside edge. So where she chews in, there's these little tiny chew marks on the outside edges. And a woodpecker hole is going to be tapered like a woodpecker beak. So kind of cone-shaped, their holes are going to be cone-shaped as well. Our exit holes are perfectly round and go in perfectly straight. Because ALB go so far into the tree, that woodpecker would have to work really hard to get to that larva. So the holes that they make are going to be fairly large. And they'll do that. They'll go after the same spot over and over. So I would assume woodpecker populations have gone up, but not enough to keep it in check. And then any other opportunistic animals, probably raccoons and possums. It's a pretty big beetle, and the larva is actually pretty large as well. So whatever type of animals are going to go after larvae. It really depends on where we are working within the quarantine as to whether or not we're finding infested trees or not. So there are parts of the quarantine that we haven't found any infested trees, but we need to check anyway. So we go back to the same properties over and over to make sure that we haven't missed anything. So right now we are working near what we call the core of our infestation, where we first found it. That first homeowner called in. So we expect to find infested trees right now. So most of our work is on private property. We do have East Fork State Park within our quarantine zone, and we do survey the trees on that land, but most of our work is on private property. So we knock on doors to gain access to the properties. Our crews will go out and survey. If they can't figure out what something is from the ground, then the climbers will come in. And we have a QA process where they'll come and look at a representative amount of the trees, and we are entering this data on our iPads using a software called Roam, and it captures geospatial data. So basically I plot a point for every tree I look at, and I can edit the details to that tree. So like tree species and DBH, and if it's infested, how infested it is. So if a tree is infested, then the removal team will come in and they make a plan with the homeowner. So everything that you want to cover as far as access, avoiding certain areas. If you have like a rose bush that's been in the family for 3 generations, we want to work with property owners as much as we can. So we'll create a plan, remove the trees, and then the process is over for that round of survey. We can't get to every single property every year, but we do go back to properties several times.
Do you guys remove the stump too, or is it like the whole tree? Everything's gone.
That's a great question. I was actually asked that last night in another outreach event. We do, and it depends on the setting. So in a yard where a tree is actively taken care of, manicured, mowed around, we're gonna remove the stump, grind it. If you've ever seen a stump grinder, they're pretty interesting. They'll grind below grade, and we actually remove those stump grindings because, again, just a small piece of wood could be enough for an ALB. So we want to remove those stump grindings, put back topsoil, and put it all back to grade. Right now we don't have a tree replacement program. That wasn't built into the budget of this project. So the goal of this project is eradication, and that means completely get rid of the bug, which is different than some other invasive species projects like maybe gypsy moth, where we know we only can suppress those, where we might not ever get rid of some invasive species, but the goal of this project is to completely get rid of them. And that's happened in other parts of the country. So, yeah. I forgot what I was saying.
But just a normal work day, and I guess I have a question now too. How many invasive species are you guys dealing with in the state of Ohio?
There are several. Yeah. So there are vegetative invasive species, and then there's animals that are also invasive species, and different agencies will work with those throughout the state. So this project, I work for the Ohio Department of Agriculture, but it's a cooperative program with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So that's very typical when you're working with invasive species. I couldn't even guess, but the big ones right now are Asian longhorn beetle as an insect. Emerald ash borer has already made its way through this area and other parts of the country. Spotted lanternfly is one to look out for as far as insects. And then
naughty wine destroying
Yeah.
fly, right?
Vegetatively, we have Japanese honeysuckles just everywhere, and then there's another one called autumn olive or Russian olive, which is another understory plant like honeysuckle, and those types of invasive species, they have strategies to outgrow and outlast our native species. So I actually went to school for wildlife management, and part of managing our wildlife is managing their habitats. And a lot of that in this part of the country is trees. So I learned my trees in school with a true dendrology class. And we went out into the field and had, quizzes out in there at all times of the year. So in Ohio, our trees have leaves in the summer, but then those leaves fall, most of them. So I learned in a school setting, and it was just something interesting to me. So I kind of learned more of it on my own. But when I came here, I had to learn some new species. And really what we focus on is what species ALB can infest. We call those host species. And then the other trees that are going to be growing natively in our forest. So it does take some time to get used to. It doesn't really matter what type of background you come from. We have true entomologists on this project that went to school to study insects. And then like me, I had wildlife and all different types of backgrounds. But you have to learn how to identify the tree species first. That's step one in my mind. So when we go out to a property, we're not looking at every single tree. We're looking at the host tree species. So yeah, learning tree ID is the first step. And then getting used to what are normal characteristics for that tree species. Red maple, which is one of its favorite trees and one of the most common trees we have around here, has vertical cracks in the bark just as part of its natural bark pattern. So when there's damage caused to a tree, sometimes that can cause a vertical crack. And it just takes a while for you to build up your own knowledge and your own confidence about what you think might be damage and what you think might be a natural part of that tree. And that's one of the reasons we work in teams, so that you can always bounce your ideas off someone else. And even though I've been doing this for almost 10 years now, if I were out working in a crew today, if I saw something that I wasn't sure about, I would call my whole team over and we would take time to look at it, and look at it from different angles too, because trees are round, and when you're looking at something straight on, it can look like a hole, and your depth perception is a little bit messed up. So if you take a couple steps to either direction, you can really tell if something is convex or concave. And branch scars on trees look a lot like holes. So where a branch has fallen off and it's laid down a couple extra layers like a scar, those can occur in very round formations as well. I would say any type of, if you're going to school, any type of biology is a great place to start. You know, that's a very broad category, and you can get more specific. We've had, you know, cellular biologists on this program before, but then just, yeah, learning the tree species in your native environment. So you can get tree guides. That's a good place to start. There's dichotomous keys that take things of similar groupings and then they get more and more specific. So for trees or flowers, you would start with how many petals are on this flower, and then it would give you a smaller answer. And if they're, what color are they, then it would give you a smaller answer. So learning your trees and your native plants is a good place to start. And doing anything you can to get in. If you want to get into an agency, sometimes you do have to volunteer. So there's volunteer opportunities at your parks and other natural areas. I think that would be a good place. So lifting the quarantines would be the next step. And we have actually been able to do that in parts of Ohio. So our main quarantine in Bethel is about 57 square miles. And the first year we found the beetle in 2011, we also found a couple other sites that were farther away from our main quarantine that we didn't want to expand it to encompass that entire area. So we made them their own satellite quarantines, and they were much smaller. So what we did was we found the infested trees there, we cut those down, and then we go back to survey. And we have to go back and survey several times and not find any more infested trees before we are comfortable with saying, okay, there's no more risk for the beetle being here, and it's now eradicated. So we had 2 satellite quarantines where we were able to do that, and we also used a combination of chemical treatment in those areas. So chemical treatment for this bug can only be used preventatively. So it goes back to the tree biology, and that our insect goes all the way into the heartwood, which is dead wood. That tree can't move any nutrients, and it also can't move any chemical in there. So once the larva is already inside, it doesn't matter if we put chemicals in it now, it can't reach that beetle. So what we do in those areas where we're really sure that there's no more beetle signs that we can find, we can treat the maple trees and the host trees to prevent other beetles from coming back. That's very costly, and it's worked well in other areas of the country where they didn't have the same conditions that we do. So in Ohio, we're in rural Ohio with large tracts of private land and large woodlots, hundreds of trees. And in other parts of the country, they had park trees or street trees where it was more cost effective. So right now, our main tool that we use to fight against ALB in Ohio is surveying. That's always a hard, timeline is hard to predict, but in other parts of the country, ALB has been eradicated, in Chicago and New Jersey and parts of New York. So we know it can be done, and our quarantine is not the biggest, largest area, so Massachusetts has a larger quarantine. The project in New York was wrapped up around 10 years. So we're right at that 10-year mark here. And we have only one main quarantine, but we are still finding infested trees. So as long as we keep finding infested trees, there will be a program. We did just complete work in the core of our area quarantine zone, and we did not find very many infested trees at all. So that is very encouraging that our efforts are actually working. So it's hard to say. I think definitely another 5 years we'll be here. Longer than that, it's hard to estimate. So I am a project employee. Our state employees here are all project employees. So it's a federally funded project. The USDA works with us here, and if that federal emergency funding were to go away, the state positions would no longer have funding because it's a project. They're not full-time state employees. So the only job I do is Asian longhorn beetle. I don't work on any other invasives, and neither does any of the other staff. So if we were to eradicate the beetle, or if that funding were to be taken away for some reason, I would not be guaranteed a job in another part of the state or on another invasive species project. But that's the nature of projects. You know, we don't want to be here forever. We want to eradicate the beetle. So. I think if you want to check your own trees in your home or in your community, I would focus on maple trees, because every time we have found a new infestation, it's been in a maple. So some of the maples you have around here are going to be red maples, sugar maples, silver maples. And what you're looking for are signs that the adult has been there. So those egg sites with the mandible scars on the outside edges, where the larva has tunneled through, and then that perfectly round exit hole. And those three characteristics are very unique to this beetle. So if you find damage in your trees that looks like this, you can call our program and we'll come out and check for you. Or if you find a beetle that you think looks similar to ALB, we'll come out and check for your trees as well. And we'd rather check a million false calls than miss one that was really there.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.